لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى صحبه أجمعين. So we had left off talking about this idea of paradigms. We mentioned there's a particular dominant paradigm that has a history behind it, and there's kind of a longer history, but the shorter history only goes back about 200, 250 years. Before that, there was a different type of paradigm that was not so dissimilar to what we were currently talking about of an Islamic paradigm. So we mentioned some of those points, specifically regarding how we have this concept of the absolute. We do have the concept of the relative, but there's also a concept of the absolute. There's a concept of the sacred. There's a concept of zahir and batin, of things appearing a particular way outwardly, but then there are inward things that are more indicative of its reality than the outward aspect. So, in our inner reality, we're souls, not just bodies. And therefore, the way that we define one's humanity is not by their exterior, their outward. In the literature today, if you read a lot of the magazines and articles, and even in peer-reviewed literature, you have this growing use of the word bodies to talk about human beings. So it'll say brown bodies and black bodies and white bodies and these type of bodies. So as if it's identifying, right, classifying people according or merely based upon their physical aspect, right? And you don't get this feeling of a greater sense of this idea of this sacredness, this inviolability of being a human being, of humanity as a whole, which I would argue would come from a grounded understanding of Islam. And those are important points to make, I think. They're not insignificant. So this is just to give you some idea of kind of the differences in the paradigms. What I want to do next is kind of show you, well, how did we get to this particular dominant paradigm, especially in our understanding of justice, and then compare it to, well, what's an Islamic understanding of justice? So everything has an origin, right? Captain America has an origin story, and so does this concept of social justice. So it's generally acknowledged it wasn't used in the way, or even used at all, those two words together, social and justice, even though the ancients talked about justice. Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and the rest of them spoke about justice and had notions of justice. But the way that it's been used today is considered by someone who is a Thomist, who's in other words a follower of St. Thomas Aquinas, probably the greatest Catholic theologian living in the 13th century. And his name was Luigi Tapparelli, lived in the 1840s, and he theorized that the equality of one man to another was unequivocal in this idea of the abstract, but their respective disparities in the concrete dictate that they are naturally unequal in their individuality. So as a category as a whole, all human beings are equal, but on a discrete level, the particular level, this person is taller, this person is shorter, this person is more intelligent, this person is less intelligent. So he said there is an inherent inequality on the individual level. So individual equality then does not contradict the species equality, us as human beings, but rather it's a consequence of it. Meaning that you cannot arrive at to an individual equality, right? Because the very notion of us being a species, being a larger category, means the particulars are going to be different. Just like you have in any type of categorization where you have a general category and you have a particular category. So we might say something is big, or, bigness, which is not a word, but maybe my president would use that word. And then what does that mean? Some things are bigger than other things. So there's a question of magnitude. So they're not the same at the particular level. Even if we say something is green, well, there are shades of green. right? This is green, and the chair you're sitting on is green, and the leaves are green, but they're not all the same on the individual level. They're different. So there's an inherent inequality. So that's interesting because the way that he talked about social justice, you could make a claim that it's not the way people use it today. People use it today where they're looking for equality, equal access even on an individual level. So as trying to level the playing field, as it were, despite our inequalities. The way we use it today probably is attributed to someone by the name of John Rawls, who's still alive. He wrote A Theory of Justice in 1971. And he posited that if we were to develop this idea of social justice from the abstract by saying, let's say nobody knew anything about anybody else. Nobody has any idea of what role you play in life or how many degrees you have or who your parents are or your gender for that matter. Nobody knows anything about that. What would then be the thing that we can all agree upon, such as that each one of us would have access to that thing that we'd agreed upon without infringing upon another? So he called this the hypothetical original position, which would be defined by a veil of ignorance. Pretend you don't know anything about anybody else. And let's start from there and then define social justice from that point. So he said each person then, two things, should have equal rights to the most extensive liberties consistent with other people enjoying the same liberties, right? Because we want everyone to have it. So it's not just one person has more than the next, but everyone has to have equal access to these liberties. Therefore, inequalities should be arranged so that no one person would be blocked from occupying any position. It would be accessible. Some people criticize that. And they said one of the problems with it is, while it sounds good in theory, but on a practical level, people do have roles and positions and come from places and have positions of influence in society and so forth. So it's not exactly hypothetical, right? And they criticize Rawls because he didn't actually give you a plan of how to go about achieving this, how to go about doing this. He was theorizing about it. But it has informed many of the social justice platforms, right? And so then one of the things I think that has come out of it, that maybe I'll talk about a little bit, it comes in some of the future, the slides we're going to show, is that people then sought to frame their ability to access something, right, if they're prevented from being accessing it, by being subsumed into a type of identity, to be a group. Because then when you become part of a group, right, and then you become part of a disenfranchised group, then you fall under this definition, right? We as such and such don't have access to this and don't have access to that, right? We as people who are homosexual or lesbian, for example, we want to get married, and we didn't have that before. And so we are as a group, right? We have this identity now, right? We've given ourselves an identity. And so as an identity, as a disenfranchised or marginalized group, then we should have access, equal access, just like people who are heterosexual have access to marriage, and so forth. What would be the problem with that? Let's take it to an Islamic paradigm. We don't have the word homosexual. We have words that denote a particular behavior, but it's not an identity. It doesn't constitute an identity. In other words, it doesn't constitute as a group identifier, right? So someone may engage in some type of homosexual act, but even from, I would say, an Islamic paradigm, we wouldn't say that person is necessarily homosexual, right? Because it's not an identity. So that means, if someone asks, can a person be Muslim and homosexual? I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that if someone has an inclination towards the opposite sex or the same sex, that does not make them not Muslim anymore, right? They're still Muslim. But no, in the sense that if what you mean by homosexuality, that they can have this type of identity separate and distinct from an identity of being a Muslim, right? And somehow now I have to reconcile the two. I would say, well, that's problematic. Because for us, it's not an identity. It's a choice. It's a behavior, right? And I know that the LGBTIQ community loves to say, no, it's not a choice. But what I'm talking specifically about is acting upon a particular inclination, because that's our paradigm. We have certain methods and methodologies to deal with inclinations, which we may can be considered outside of the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But even having those inclinations doesn't make one outside of Islam, or even one sinful for that matter. So if having thoughts about having a relationship with someone of the same sex, right, may not be haram in of itself, may not be something that is necessarily you're responsible for, I should say in another way. Maybe because those thoughts came about, and we can't always control our thoughts. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does hold us responsible for our acts, for what we actually do. And so that's a different paradigm. So when we talk about access for people, and we talk about their ability to engage and have access to liberties that everybody else has, we're careful about how we identify and make identifying things. And I think that's important to make that distinction. We need to think about, I'm not saying that I have kind of the whole thing kind of mapped out, but I think we need to think about those issues and be careful about how we take these things and how we then act upon them, especially identifying groups and so forth. So that was John Rawls, and it's still kind of, I would say, the prevailing way that people frame social justice, even though there's different theories now. There are feminist theories about it, and there's other theories about it as well. But all of that did begin with classic conceptions of justice in general. So even though the word social justice wasn't used per se, they did talk about justice. And most of the time when we talk about Western civilization or the Western canon, we go back to the ancient Greeks. So people like Plato and Socrates. And Plato and Socrates and later Aristotle, they did actually affect even the Islamic discourse on much of these topics of discussion. So it's important to have some idea about them. And one of those things would be this idea that justice is embodied in the just man or the just person, right? That justice begins with being just to oneself. So then justice becomes a virtue, right? It's something to be embodied. And it sustains and it perfects the other three cardinal virtues, right, which they concluded as temperance, wisdom, and courage. And you find Arabic treatises on akhlaq, on character, and they mention these same four ones. And no doubt that they read Aristotle and they read Socrates and Plato, right? And that also tells you that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong what they arrived at, because it affected the discussion. But you can see that there was this kind of cross-civilizational, cross-cultural exchange that took place. And however, the philosophers can go so far, they can theorize, they can philosophize, but few are the people who actually followed philosophers and took them on as a way of life. They're really talking to other philosophers. So they're having kind of this little discussion between themselves, where something that's prophetic or a prophet, then that's someone who is actually giving you a way to go about living about life. Aristotle, similar. He was a student of Plato in the sense that justice is a virtue of the soul. And then he talked about different types of justices, distributive and corrective. Right? And distributive is probably what we mean by social justice today, that people are dividing, what he said, benefits and burdens, what I would say rights and responsibilities, among members of the community. So the idea that communities cannot survive and cannot thrive except that there is some type of equitable distribution of those burdens and those benefits. Because if everyone was just trying to get at a benefit, then no one would assume the burdens. And that would not be a functioning society, right? And then you have to ask, how are those benefits and burdens to be distributed? If we go by John Rawls and say everybody's kind of an equal, right, even in their particular inequalities, then is that best for the community? Or do certain people have certain aptitudes, certain skills, certain abilities, certain proclivities that would make them more suitable for a particular own society versus another one? And that's basically what Ibn Khaldun says in the Muqaddimah. He was widely considered to be the first social theorist or sociologist, and he said that the way that different roles in society are distributed is because certain people have certain proclivities and inclinations, and so they're going to go with the thing that they have a skill for or the thing that they're drawn to. And that's different amongst different people, right? And so everyone is going to find that particular space in society, and it's also going to be based upon the demand for such a thing. So while maybe everyone wants to be the head or the leader or, you know, all of the benefits that, you know, and the accolades that go along with that, not everyone's going to reach that. And so people naturally are going to fit into the different roles that they have. And so there's going to be inherent inequalities with this. And he even lamented the idea that scholars or people of knowledge, even though what they do and what they produce is vitally important for society, society more often than not doesn't recognize that significance and importance. So he was saying that they're usually the poorest of people, even though the skills and abilities that they have and the things that they're producing may be vital and important. But then there's the other factor that society even recognize that as being vital and important. So society will put value on those things, not necessarily the most important things, but maybe the things that they deem to be the most they are in need of at the particular time. And that's kind of the paradox, or I would say the challenge in dawah and in sacred knowledge and so forth, is that you kind of have to convince people that they have a need for it, because it's not a self-evident need. It's not a self-evident need. Self-evident need, you need food, you need shelter, right? As they say, real estate never goes out of business. You know, on a trajectory, real estate will always be increasing. You look at a 10 to 20 year trajectory of any real estate anywhere in the world, and it's always going to be more valuable unless there was some type of complete, you know, migration from that place. But short of that, just things staying as they are, because people will have children and there'll be more people, and so there'll be more demand on a limited supply. And that's just how it works. Whereas traditionally in the Muslim world, in order to make sure that this enterprise of knowledge was still being propagated and still being worked upon, they made these awqaf, or these endowments. So certain members, certain segments of society recognized the importance, and then they sustained it, made sure that it went on, and so forth. So sometimes justice doesn't always work out exactly according to the way that we think it should work out. So they recognize that, you know, there may be an ideal scenario, there may be something what we call mithali, right? Something that would work in the ideal of the abstract, but in a real life situation, we're going to address the real life situation as it is, not as we wish it to be, or as how we want to see it to be. And many of the ahkam, many of the legal rulings in Islam are looking at that reality, not according to some kind of mythic ideal that can't really be achieved. So, for example, you look at some of the requirements for court testimony. And people love to put out the trope, even though it's not really true, that the testimony of a man is equal to the testimony of two women. And that's not actually true. It's only kind of applicable in certain scenarios, certain situations. There are situations where the testimony of a woman is more than the testimony of a man, especially in marriage situation. They dispute who received the dowry. Did she receive the dowry or not receive the dowry? Well, if it's his word against her word, then they take her word, for example. But then you find that there is no distinction between whether man or woman in certain things that are even more important than testimony. Like what? Like hadith narration. There's no difference in terms of gender, in terms of whether the hadith narrator is a woman or a man. No distinction is made. The only thing that they look at is ad-dabt wal-adala. They look at dabt, which is the precision in transmitting that hadith, and the trustworthiness, regardless of gender. So then the question becomes, why then the difference? Why in something that's more important, we're talking about what Rasulullah ﷺ said or didn't say, and we don't care if it was a man or a woman, or even a slave for that matter, or an ex-slave. But in court testimony, there's different rules. And the answer to that is, it's looking at the reality as it is. And part of justice in this life is not reaching an absolute type of justice, which is unattainable, but rather that people's relationships can continue, can sustain themselves, and we have a relative sense of a feeling of justice and sociability within society, as a sense of harmony. And so, even though justice may be absolutely served in one sense, but if people feel that it's not being served, then they're going to take matters into their own hands, or it could lead them to take matters in their own hands. And so certain scenarios, like in a business dispute or a business transaction, yeah, in some cases, yes, what would normally require one man's testimony, the Quran specifically says, two women's testimony. Not because they're any less than a man, or that they have any less of a precision or adala, but so that the semblance, and according to the participants, they feel that justice was served. So it's actually based upon shortcomings and failings of a human nature, rather than anything that is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designating one gender to be less than the other. And that's an important aspect, right? Because when we talk about justice in general, it's not just about this is just, it has to be done, let's just go do it. But do you have the ability to do it? Do you have the ability to reach it? Or in your pursuit of acquiring it, do you commit several injustices along the way that would lead to even greater harm? And so when we talk a little bit more about the Islamic sense of justice, we'll get into that a little bit. So Aristotle also said that justice is a balance between disproportionate excess and deficiency. So this idea that it's a balance between two extremes was something that was also kind of adopted by Muslim theologians as well. When they talked about the virtues, they said that justice also was a balance between two extremes. Courage was a balance between two extremes, between cowardice and between recklessness. Then in the middle, in the balance, you have courage, and so forth. St. Thomas of Aquinas, as we mentioned earlier, the main Catholic theologian, and he said that justice then is divine in nature, right? So a habit whereby a man renders to each his due by a constant and perpetual will, that constant and perpetual will is God. So if God wills this thing to be just, then the habit by which you try to render that, everyone his due. So this idea of rights and responsibilities. And it would not be a stretch to say that he acquired that understanding from someone like Al-Ghazali, which most scholars said that he would have read Al-Ghazali, at least in Latin, because he preceded him. So again, going back to the idea of rights and responsibilities. And then natural law is divine law. Again, that's something he could have gotten from an Islamic understanding, because we'll see in the Islamic paradigm, that which is good is that which is determined to be good by Allah, by God. And that which is bad is that what Allah deems to be bad, no matter how we may feel about it. So I want to kind of skip over this a little bit because in interest of time, it's not that relevant. Modern concept of justice, beginning with Thomas Hobbes, who took a very, I would say, pessimistic view. Basically, we're all out to get one another and everyone man for himself, and if we don't have a sovereign or authoritarian leader over us, then everyone is just going to wind up killing everybody else. And so you need to have this kind of strong authoritarian leader in place. Unfortunately, some academics think that the Muslims adopted this Hobbes or Hobbesian way of looking at things, which I don't agree with. They didn't talk about it in that way. They said that there has to be leadership, and you have certain chapters in theological handbooks that talk about nasb al-imama, which is to have a leader in place, right? And you need a leader in place, not so that you can prevent people from killing and warring against each other, but because it will facilitate the execution of rights and fulfillment of responsibilities and execution of rights. And that there has to be some type of arbiter between what would be contentious issues such as occur in commercial transactions and occurs in things that are of a justice nature, people doing harm to one another, right? Whenever there's some contention about something, it always requires a third party outside of those two parties to try to resolve it. And that's one of the parameters of affecting justice. Hobbes also was probably kind of one of the early secularists. And he said that men and women are just bodies. There's no spirit behind it. So that's why he's considered to be one of the modern thinkers, because in modernity, which is the dominant paradigm now, is that we're not spiritual souls, that we're just atoms and molecules, and we're just going to decompose in the ground, and that's it. There's no value to it after that. And you put on top of that the Darwinian theory. So we just happened to win out in the Darwinian sweepstakes. We were the fittest, and so we survived. And the monkeys and the dolphins don't rule the world because they just didn't evolve in the same way that we did and to the level that we did, and so that's where we're in the position that we're in, right? And those are not just science theories that our children study in biology class in the 10th grade or the 9th grade. Those are viewpoints that affect the way people see the world and the way that people affect that they try to affect change and deal with one another. They're not innocuous. They're not value-free. They are full of value, right? So don't think the science class is just kind of, it's science, it's safe. They're not studying philosophy, at least, or mathematics, or philosophy or sociology or psychology, where a lot of these liberal Western theories. No, in your science class, the whole underpinning is that. And I could probably make an argument to tell you that that may even be more corruptive and more dangerous than the philosophy class. Because at least in philosophy, they're saying it's philosophy. In the science class, they're telling you this is the way the world is. This is fact, right? This is data. This is unassailable. And it's not unassailable. It's not fact, right? Science in and of itself is also, the present day science is based upon certain myths as well. And one of those myths is that with an instrument, right, that is limited in what it can perceive, whether it's a telescope or a microscope, I can somehow tell you the reality of those things because I have something that can magnify its size to my eyes. And that's not necessarily true. Because when they went into the quantum level of the atom, they discovered that it was operating by a whole different set of rules than what Newton had postulated. So Newtonian physics doesn't apply at the quantum level. And there's a Heisenberg uncertainty principle. You can't tell if that thing is a wave or a particle, or where that electron is going to be from one point to the next. You can't predict it. It's unpredictable, right? And science is built upon one of those myths is that if you can see how something behaves in the past, then you can predict how it's going to behave in the future. That's the basic premise behind science, right? And then that is never changing, always going to be the same. But when they get to the quantum level, they figure out, well, wait a minute, we can't even predict where that's going to be. We can't even say on past behavior it's going to be in this place. So it kind of threw a wrench in the whole idea of this type of prediction. And the same thing to the celestial realm. They postulated certain Newtonian laws. The universe has a constant density, is one of them. And then they saw certain parts of the universe doesn't behave the way that it's supposed to behave, right? They couldn't figure out the orbits based upon this idea of constant density. So they said, you know what? Let's just call that dark matter because it doesn't work like matter. So we'll call it dark matter. And I may be being a little facetious, but that's basically what happened, right? So they put a name to it because it doesn't behave like they expect it to behave. Do they actually know what it is? No, they don't know what it is. But it just doesn't behave like their expectations. So, the modern era began with this theorizing that God no longer needs to be in the picture. And like Stephen Hawking says, if we can solve the gaps, if we can get rid of God of the gaps, we get rid of God. And God of the gaps means in church doctrine, right, or ancient church doctrine, there's this idea of mystery, the mystery of the universe. And so everything operates that we can't understand according to some type of mystery. Well, when modern science started making some theories, or even we could say sound ideas about how some of these mysteries operate, then the church began to lose its kind of hold on the idea of mystery. So Stephen Hawking says, well, these are gaps. We don't know how the thing works. But once we figure out how to work, right, and we can see the science behind it, then we don't have to say God knows how it works, or God is the one who's making it work, because we figured it out. From a metaphysical viewpoint, that's not a sound way. I can say I know how this Mac laptop works, right? I can open it up, but can I produce one is a whole other thing. So even if we can map the human genome, doesn't mean we can produce a human being, right? From scratch. Bring all the raw materials and just, produce one. It's not you can't give life. So that is part of kind of the greater understanding of the modern paradigm, and that we're on this road towards eventually understanding everything. And that has ethical implications, because if all human beings are bodies, right, well, bodies can be enhanced, and bodies can be given AI, right? And then, if Google wants to plant a hard drive in my head to expand my memory, because all I am is a physical entity. But what if there's a soul behind that? How does that fit with hardware and AI, artificial intelligence enhancements, and so forth? Again, it's based upon a particular worldview, the way of seeing the world. And if we truly want to be Muslim, then we have to figure out, how do we see the world? And if we really see it clearly, we're going to say a lot of these ways of seeing the world are harmful to humanity. They don't enhance humanity. They're harmful to humanity. And the definition of justice is, first and foremost, doing no harm. Not to bring harm to anything, right? And also to bring good to it, to bring benefit. But then harm and benefit have to be clearly defined. And so harm is not just about physical harm, it's also about spiritual harm. And that's one thing that wasn't part of the modern equation. When they made the first telephone call between New York and San Francisco, nobody thought about, well, why does someone in New York have to talk to somebody in San Francisco? They just said, we can do it, right? And when, and this is documented, you go look it up, when Facebook hires psychoanalysts and psychologists and psychiatrists so they can figure out what are some of the addictive mechanisms that will cause people to engage more with their particular platform. Are they thinking about the spiritual effects of these things? Or are they just looking at dollar signs? Because can you make an argument there's spiritual harm? And now in the Far East, you actually have addiction centers for people who are addicted to some of these video games. You don't think the people who make the video games study human psychology, right? The whole idea of, if you play any type of video game that's, what's it called, when you're the first person looking at the RO, what's it called? Huh? Like first-person shooter games or adventure games where you succeed via certain tasks you need to do, and then you progress, right, to certain levels. There's a certain, satisfaction. Perhaps even there's a chemical reaction, like dopamine levels go higher when you achieve the level, right? And then you go on to the next level, and then it keeps you continuously playing. It would have been unimaginable in the pre-modern time for someone to actually sit and do a single activity for 24 hours straight. But people do that now. They'll sit and do for something 24 hours straight. They'll play video games for 24 hours straight. They'll watch Netflix for 24 hours straight. Binge watching, right? You don't think that they thought about how can we make people sit and watch and binge watching, right? When you're on your Netflix or Amazon Prime and then you watch the episode and then the second episode automatically starts, right? Before you have a chance to hit close. You think that's by accident? It's not, right? So no one is thinking this aspect of our humanity where is this spiritual harm. We put it in the realm of the psychiatric or the psychological, right? And then we take it back to chemical imbalances and so forth. But what about the idea of the spirit, right? What about the link of the spirit, the soul, to ethics and behavior and deeds that you may do and the way that you look at the world? Where are the connections in all of those things? And I would tell to you that the Islamic paradigm is firmly integrated all of those things together. So the spiritual, the emotional, the intellectual, and the physical. They're really all aspects of the same whole. There's no difference. And so when The ulama of the Sharia, of the Islamic tradition, were looking at those things that are harmful, those things that are beneficial, and so forth. They're looking at all levels. You read, for example, in the chapter about using vessels of water to make wudu, and then they'll tell you that a vessel made out of copper or brass, if it's left in the sun, it's disliked to make wudu from that container. And you're thinking, why? And they said, well, sabab tibbi, right? The reason is a medical reason, because maybe some of the copper or the brass, kind of the sediments of it, get into the water, and then if you wash your mouth out with that, then you may be swallowing some of that. So it may have some type of harmful effect upon you. So it wasn't a strictly spiritual Sharia kind of reason, but they even go to a physical reason. But they considered those things, right, about the idea of harm or no harm, of benefit versus harm. وهكذا. So Thomas Hobbes, pessimistic guy. Real quick, Locke and Hume. Locke was similar to Hobbes, but more optimistic. He thought, however, that people can recognize that other people have rights and liberties, but there still needed to be sort of a central authority by which to make sure that that would be enforced. But he also said that authority should not infringe upon the lives or liberties of the governed, and authority is held accountable by the people. Unlike Hobbes, who thought the authority was unassailable by the people, Locke thought that no, people should have some recourse to taking that authority into account because he's a representative of the people. So kind of not like the divine right of kings that Hobbes kind of was following, but something different. And a lot of modern political discourse is based upon Locke's ideas. David Hume also had theories about morality. He's considered kind of the father of this type of philosophical empiricism. Basically what you see is what you get, and people don't really make rational decisions. It's more based upon their emotions and how they feel about something. So we classify things into approval versus disapproval, and then that would be the moral. So the central theme that you see here is in Western philosophy. They oscillated either between, especially modern philosophy, the idea that reason can get you to a moral perspective, or that reason doesn't get you to a moral perspective, and that it will be based upon some type of society consensus. And that's important, right? Because that defines how people define what's acceptable today and what's not acceptable, what's good behavior and what's not good behavior, what's legal even and what's illegal. And when we understand about an Islamic paradigm, we'll see that it doesn't conform to those things. It has something quite different. So are we supposed to take a 5-minute stretch break or something like that?